going to spend a few moments this morning talking about the Plains of Ono. The Plains of Ono. That may not be a place we're familiar with. Most of us probably are not. It's not a real commonly talked about place, but it is a place that we need to stay away from. It's a very dangerous place, a place that could be very destructive to all of us. Now, as we mentioned, we may not be familiar with this place. It's something that's not mentioned many times in the scriptures. The Plains of Ono were actually a literal place. It was supposed to have been somewhere in the tribe of Benjamin near the Jordan River. But, that's really not the point we're going to get at this morning, but we're going to try to lead up to this point and try to make some spiritual applications of this Plains of Ono, and especially when it comes to the point of us compromising with sin. Compromising with evil people for the sake of peace. We just don't want to do that. We don't make compromises when it comes to what's right and wrong just for the sake of peace. Now, our lesson today comes from one of the times this area is mentioned during the life of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah, I think I've mentioned before and probably mentioned about others in the Old Testament, is one of my favorite characters. And I think my favorite characters probably kind of change as I study each one. As I study another one, he becomes a favorite. But Nehemiah, he's kind of stood the test of time. And Nehemiah was, he kind of gives me the idea he was a man's man. I mean, he's kind of a tough guy. After they had, one story that kind of brings that out to me is after they had rebuilt those walls of Jerusalem, he went back over and had them rebuild those walls, and they had some merchants come in on Saturday, on the Sabbath day. They came in from Tyre, and they were camped outside the city, so they'd come in on Sabbath day, and they could come in there and sell their goods and do all this work on the Sabbath day that these Israelites were not supposed to do. And so Nehemiah, boy, he hung the gates back up, and he shut them on the Sabbath day. And these people still came and camped outside the city. And after they did it a couple times, Nehemiah said, hey, you don't come back here anymore. You come back here again, I'm going to put my hands on you. And I'm going to lay hands on you, I think is the way it reads. And that was, that kind of, he's a tough guy. But he was also a man of great importance. As we go through the story, we'll see some of that. We're going to go through the first few minutes of the lesson, kind of giving a background of what happens with Nehemiah leading up to these Plains of Ono. Now, the nation of Judah at the time we're talking about this morning had gone away into Babylonian captivity. They had been in that Babylonian captivity for 70 years. That captivity had come to an end. The Babylonian Empire had come to an end, and the Medes and the Persians were in power at this point. This Jewish captivity had come to an end, and when it ended, many of these Jews returned back to the area of Jerusalem and Judea. A lot of them went back, not nearly all of them, but a lot of them did. Nehemiah and men like Mordecai and women like Esther, they decided to stay in the area where they were. They did not return to Jerusalem. But they returned to a city that had been completely destroyed by the Babylonian army. Jerusalem had been completely destroyed. The walls of the city had been broken down. They had plundered the temple. The temple had been burnt with fire. The palaces in the city had been burnt with fire. There was just not much left of that once grand and beautiful city that had been standing during the days of Solomon. The beautiful temple that Solomon had built had just been completely decimated. But these people went back, and this is what they went back to. Now, this destruction is described for us over in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. It says in verse 17, therefore he, talking about God, brought against them the king of the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans is just another name for the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. Some of these men were actually killed in the temple itself. And had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. God gave all of them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Now, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, if you want to know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, it went to Babylon. We never hear about it again after this. It was probably some of those articles that were taken over to Babylon and probably was at one point melted down and the gold used for something else. I don't think that's something anybody will ever find. But they took all these treasures back to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious possessions. This once beautiful city has just been completely destroyed, just completely wiped out. Verse 20, and those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kings of Persia. They remained in Babylonian captivity, actually until the end of Babylon, up until the end, to the Nebuchadnezzar and his sons, to the time of the kingdom of Persia, till the Medes and Persians came into power, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Evidently, over this period of about 490 years, they had not, from my understanding, they had not let the land lay desolate 1 year out of 7 years. They weren't supposed to till the land and go out and work the land every 7 years. 1 year it was supposed to sit there desolate. And they had not done that for a period of 490 years. So God sent them into Babylonian captivity for 70 years so that the land could lay desolate and keep her Sabbaths. Now, at the end of the 70 years captivity, as we mentioned, many of them returned back to the city of Jerusalem that was still in ruins. After being destroyed, it was still in ruins. They began work on rebuilding the temple. And it took them 20 years to finish the temple. It took them a long time just to finish the temple. But they did finally get that work done, and I think when it was finished, or it may have been at the time that they laid the foundation for the new temple, but some of them that had seen Solomon's temple, they cried. They cried because what was going to be rebuilt in its place was not going to be anything like Solomon had built. And those who had never seen Solomon's temple said they were shouting for joy. It was kind of a sad, a mixed emotion kind of a situation. Now, as we pick up the story of Nehemiah, it's been about 90 years since the Jews have been allowed to return home. So we see time passing along here pretty quick. Nehemiah, he is a cupbearer to the king, and it's 90 years after the proclamation had been made by Cyrus for them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Although the temple had been rebuilt, the walls of Jerusalem were still nothing more than just a pile of rubble. The people never had gotten to the point where they had rebuilt the walls. They had worked on the temple, they had rebuilt some of their houses, but they still had done nothing to take care of the fortifications and the protection of the city. It was just a pile of rubble. Now Nehemiah, who was a Jew, lived in Shushan, which was the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now he was all the way on the other side of that great area we think of as desert right through here. He was over in this area over here somewhere. So he is there in a position of importance. He served as the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. Now what that meant was he was a tester. He's the one that carried the drinks back and forth to the king, and it was his job to make sure that no one would poison the king through something he would drink. And on occasion, it even meant that he may have to taste something to make sure that it was not poisoned before it was given to the king. So it was a position of extreme loyalty and extreme importance. And it had to be a person who the king had a great deal of trust in. And the king did have that type of trust in Nehemiah, and rightfully so. Now, when Nehemiah receives word of the conditions in Jerusalem, he's really upset. He is really upset when he hears about how poorly the people are doing there. They have no defenses. The people all around them are causing them problems. And it's just become a very difficult situation. They're still basically living in squalor. Over in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1, we read the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hananiah, one of my brethren, came with men from Jerusalem or from Judah, And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. He had a love for his homeland. I don't know if he'd ever been there or not, but he knew that's where the Jews were from. He knew that was the land that God had given them. He knew that these people were his brethren, that they were his kinsmen, and he was concerned about them. He was concerned about how things were going over there, and now he's got some people that have come back from that area, and he's got somebody who can give him firsthand information on what's taking place. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. They're in a lot of distress. They're just really having it tough. And a lot of this is being brought on them by their enemies around them. And without this wall and without those gates, they had simply no protection. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. After learning of the condition of the city of Jerusalem, Nehemiah is able to obtain permission. And we're not going to go through and read all this, but he's able to obtain the permission from the king, from Artaxerxes, to go back over to Jerusalem and to oversee the rebuilding of those walls. He goes in before the king, and he's got that sad look on his face after he gets this news, and the king looks at him and says, hey, what's wrong with you? You've never come in here looking like this before. And it kind of scared Nehemiah. King could have had his head cut off for looking like that. But he tells the king, this is what's going on, and these people are really hurting. I would like to go and see if I can help them. And the king gives him permission. He gives him letters to take with him so he can go over there and he can get these things straightened out. And as soon as, I got Jeremiah there, but as soon as Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, we see the enemies of God's people are upset about him being there even before they find out what he's come there to do. He comes to check on the people. Now, he comes with the authority of the king. He comes with some of the king's men. And he comes with letters from the king to let everybody know what's going on. But before they actually even know what his plans are about rebuilding this wall, his enemies are upset. In Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. These people hated the Israelites still. You got Sanballat and Tobiah. These are the two main enemies that Nehemiah has to deal with. But they're upset that somebody even come over and check on them. Upset that anybody would even check on them. Now, after Nehemiah and the people begin to rebuild the wall, these enemies begin to make fun of them. Now, these were not just a couple of guys out on the street. Sanballat and Tobiah and Sanballat were two men of authority. Evidently, they were co-governors of the area of Samaria, which was the area just north of Jerusalem. So these were men with some authority, so the men that really could cause them some problems. But what they do, when they find out what they're actually doing, they're rebuilding the wall, then they're over doing God's work, actually. But they begin to make fun of it. Verse 19 of chapter 2. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? What do you think you're doing? Well, they're there. Nehemiah's there to do God's work. He's there to rebuild that wall. And we see these people who are the enemies of God's people. What do? They make fun of them. They try to discourage them from doing what God wants done by making fun of them. And say, are you going to rebel against the king? Is that why you're up there rebuilding those walls? Nothing farther could have been from the truth. We see these men once again making fun of the Jews rebuilding the walls over in chapter 4. Chapter 4 and verse 1, but it so happened when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. Again, ridiculing, making fun of them. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria. Now that tells us that these are men of some authority, and these men got a little bit of power. He's there before the army. And here's what he said. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish stones that are burned? You know, most of them old stones from that previous wall still laying around in piles. He said, they're going to go over and dig up all them old stones and rebuild that wall. Well, this is just nonsense. It's lunacy he brings up as the idea that they're just too weak to do something like that. Who are they going to fortify themselves against? Are they going to fortify themselves against us? Now, Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him. And he said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall. He said, if they put up something, it's not going to last. You let a little old fox run across that wall and it's going to fall down. And we see these messages that are being put out, this ridicule, and the point of it is to discourage these Israelites, these Jews, from doing what God wanted done. This has often been a tactic of the enemies of God and his people. Make fun of them, try to shame them, and embarrass them. We've ever run across that? Somebody try to embarrass you because you're trying to do what's right. Somebody make a little fun of you because you're trying to do what's right. That still goes on today. It's been going on throughout time. When the enemies of God and God's people see people trying to do what's right, they make fun of them. They'll laugh at them. Try to make them feel bad about what they're doing. But you know what? This mocking and this ridicule that was going on there, they didn't stop Nehemiah. Shouldn't let it stop us either. Let men laugh at us. Let men think of us what they want. We need to obey God. And that's what Nehemiah and the men around him did. They continued to work. And it wasn't long until their enemies began the threats of physical violence in order to stop the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. When they saw the ridicule and the mocking and the making fun of them and trying to shame them didn't work, well, they kind of stepped it up a little bit, and they began the threats of physical violence. In Nehemiah 4 and verse 7, now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And we see some of the historical enemies of the Israelites here, don't we? We see the Arabs, the Ammonites were always enemies of them. The Ashdodites, you know who that was? That's the Philistines. Ashdod was one of those Philistine cities. When they heard that's what's going on, they become angry. When they see this work actually taking place and these gaps beginning to close up in the wall, it upsets them. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. They begin to plan to attack Jerusalem and to attack them from all sides. Down to verse 11, and our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. Now, the bad thing about this was that there were people in Jerusalem, there were Jews in Jerusalem that were allies of Sanballat and Tobiah and others. And they would bring some of these messages back and forth, and they'd come in and tell Nehemiah what's going on under the pretense of trying to make Nehemiah that they're thinking that they're trying to help him. And all along, all they're trying to do is discourage him. We probably remember what happened. Boy, it got so bad that at one time Nehemiah had the men out there, and they worked with one hand, and they had their sword in the other. But they kept working. They had men that would work during the day while others kept guard, and those would work during the night while the others kept guard. They continued on, in spite of all of this, doing the work that God wanted them to do. They weren't worried about trying to make peace with the enemies of God. That's often been the tactic of the enemies of God is physical violence. All the way back to Cain. We see what he did to Abel, his own brother. False accusations were also made against God's people. They began to make false accusations, come up with lies against Nehemiah in particular. Over in chapter 6 and verse 5, then Sanballat sent his messenger to me, as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. Now they come in and they accuse Nehemiah of stirring up a rebellion among the Jews, that they're going to rebuild the wall so that they can fortify themselves in this rebellion, and so that Nehemiah can be their king. Now that's the accusation that's made. And we're going to send that accusation back to Persia. We're going to tell the king on you. Verse 7. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king, so therefore come and let us consult together. Now we see them here. We're going to kind of blackmail you through lies to get you to come out and talk with us. Making these false accusations against God and his people has been a tactic of the enemies of God since the beginning of time. We see these very same things in the life of Christ, don't we? They mocked him. They ridiculed him. Made false accusations against him. And ultimately crucified him. Beat him and crucified him. It's not anything new. If we have people who make false accusations against us when we're Christians because we're Christians, don't be surprised. It's happened to the people of God before. If they threaten us with physical violence like is going on in some parts of the world even today because we're followers of God, don't be surprised because we're not the first. But we do need to be like Nehemiah and in spite of these things, continue to work. Continue to do the work that God has set before us. Now, when their enemies see the work on the wall is about to be completed, that's when they want to talk. They hadn't been able to stop it. We've threatened violence. We've accused them of things. That hadn't stopped it. We've made fun of them. That hasn't stopped it. So now let's get in here and let's talk. Let's have a conference and let's see if we can reach some kind of compromise here. Let's see if we can strike up some kind of deal. Maybe we can work together somehow. This too has often been a tactic of the enemies of God, trying to get the followers of God to compromise with evil. Trying to get them to compromise with evil for the sake of peace. For the sake of peace. Chapter 6 and verse 1, now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time I had not hung the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. What do they want? They want Nehemiah to come out there away from the protection of the city into the plain of Ono under the pretense, Nehemiah, that we can work this thing out. Maybe we can work together. You know, they had tried at one point to participate in this, and Nehemiah wouldn't let them. But Nehemiah, come on out here. Let's go out to the plains of Ono and let's just discuss this thing and let's work this thing out. Maybe there's some kind of compromise that we can come to where everybody can be happy. But Nehemiah knew. He went out there, they'd destroy him. They wanted to do him harm. We need to understand that about wicked people too. Many times they want to do us harm. Fortunately, Nehemiah had enough sense not to compromise with evil. He knew he had nothing to gain by going out and talking to these men who had already shown they had absolutely no interest in doing the work of God. He was smart enough to stay away from the plains of Ono. He knew these evil men were not interested in helping him or the Jews. All they wanted to do was to stop the work. All they wanted to do was to stop the work of God that had been going on in that location. And he knew a trip to the Plains of Ono would only lead to his own destruction. Nehemiah was smart enough to recognize that. Now, do we have enough sense to avoid the Plains of Ono ourselves? Are we smart enough to realize that if we go out and we try to compromise with evil, that it's going to lead to our own destruction? Are we smart enough to realize if we try to compromise with evil for the sake of peace, so that everybody can get along, so there won't be any fussing and fighting, no arguing in a family maybe, no problems among friends, that, you know what, let's just compromise here. Happens a lot of times. We can't compromise with evil on things that are right and wrong, not even for the sake of peace. And there's one thing that's going on that we'll talk about in just a moment that we need to be careful about and keep our eyes open for. And that's a compromise between congregations of the Lord's people and the denominational world. Do we think we can work with the enemies of God and compromise with evil? Do we think we can do that? There's a movement going on today in which all the churches in an area get together and have joint worship services. You ever heard of that going on? It wasn't too many years ago that they had a big thing over at the Pyramid, I think before Bass Pro opened up over there. And all the people from all different congregations, from all the different faiths, with the plural, the S at the end of it, the faiths, showed up there, and it may have been like on an Easter Sunday or something. And they all got together and they all worshiped God together. One of the things that's going on and has gone on in this community and others is you'll have the Baptist preacher go and he'll preach for the Methodists, and you'll have that Methodist preacher go and he'll preach for the Presbyterians, and this thing just goes around in a circle, and you have the Presbyterian preacher go preach for the Assembly of God Church, and et cetera. And they do this preacher swapping every once in a while. And they do this for unity. They do this for peace among the faiths. They'll have a joint worship service for people of all faiths to attend. And that's always given me a little problem, that word faiths, because over in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 5 it says we have one Lord, one faith, and one baptism. So when we have somebody out here talking about all these people of different faiths, that don't throw up a red flag, because the Bible says there's one. But they have all these groups together for the sake of unity, for the sake of peace. They pool their resources to go out and help the poor of the area. Many of them think it's the work of the church to take care of the poor of the world. And they'll pool their resources to do that. And we hear them talk about MIFA on the news quite a bit. And MIFA over in Memphis is the Memphis Interfaith Association. And what they do is they collect money and they collect goods to distribute to the poor of the world. But that's an example of all these different faiths coming together and working together and coming to some compromise. I was told not too long ago, one of the local Church of Christ preachers participated in one of these preacher swapping events. And I'm sure there have been others. They've gone out and participated in these things, and he was allowed to go and preach to a Baptist church in town. Allowed to go and preach to a Baptist church. Now, on the surface, that may sound like a good thing. Got an opportunity to go there to the Baptist church with the people in the crowd. You got your audience there. And if he went in and taught about the truth of the plan of salvation, and he taught the truth about being saved by faith only, that really sounds like a pretty good thing. It does. Kind of doubt that's what happened. Kind of doubt that's what he preached on. He may have. But what was the cost? Even if he did, what was the cost? Because remember what this situation is? It's a preacher swapping thing. Was a false teacher then allowed to come into the congregation of the Lord's people and spew his false doctrine? If you go preach there, then he comes preach here. So what's he preaching? Comes and preaches false doctrine. Normalizes the relationship between the Lord's church and those kingdoms around us. Remember, that was the problem that the Israelites had. They wanted to be like the kingdoms and the nations around them. The Lord's church can't be like the kingdoms or the nations around them. It needs to be separate. We don't need to allow people to come into this congregation or any congregation of the Lord's people and spew false doctrine. Such wickedness should not be tolerated in the church. It shouldn't be tolerated. Making a deal with the devil is never a good idea. Now, men's come up with a lot of ideas in order to grow the church, in his opinion, outside of what the Bible has taught. But making a deal with the devil, compromising with what's right and what's wrong, is never a good idea. When we compromise with evil men and false teachers, helping them to propagate their false doctrine, then we've strayed into the Plains of Ono and will be destroyed. We don't need to do it. We need to stay away from these type things. Stay away from compromises with evil men. Listen to what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14. Now, a lot of times we apply this principle to a Christian marrying a non-Christian, but this principle applies across the board. But do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial, or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? They ought to be separate. They ought to be separate. The church doesn't have any business getting involved into agreements and relationships with churches and denominations that teach false doctrine. And what agreement has the temple of God, which is the church, with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. What's our conclusion this morning? Verse 17. Therefore come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. We're not to intermingle with and participate in those type things. We need to be separate. We don't need to compromise with evil. We don't need to be looking for unity with those who have no interest in doing things the way God wants them done. As Christians in a congregation, we cannot afford to make alliances with the wicked that compromise on what is right and what is wrong. If we do, it could cost us our soul. It could. Do we remember what God told King Jehoshaphat after he made an alliance with Ahab? Do you remember what happened and what God told him? And Jehu, the son of Hananiah the seer, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those that hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. Now, if we remember the story behind that, he had made an alliance with Ahab, even against God's advice. He had made that alliance with him, went into battle with him against, I believe it was Ben-Hadad and the Syrian army. And they get out there and they kill Ahab, and they almost kill Jehoshaphat. They almost kill him because of this alliance that was made for him, but God spared his life. God spared his life because he said he did see something good in him. But the problems you're suffering right now, he says, is because the wrath of the Lord is upon you because you have decided to help the wicked and love those who have hated the Lord. We can't afford to compromise with evil. This alliance with the wicked almost cost Jehoshaphat his life, but we allow similar alliances to destroy our soul. Too great a cost, too much at stake. We need to guard our soul with everything we've got. Well, that's the conclusion of our lesson this morning, and we're going to have just a short intermission before the next service.